Hey guys, how you doing? This is Alex, and today we're talking Gen 3 10R80 boosted combos. So let's establish this right off the bat. You can go quicker, easier in a Gen 3 Mustang, especially if it comes with a 10R80. Reason being is the gear stack is nice and tight, the engine makes more power with the added compression, better cams, and better flowing heads, and the vetting of the tuning is pretty much done all the way up to 2023 as of July. Basically all the way up to 2023, you can get all the saucy stuff you could have gotten back in 18 to 20. Now 21 to 23, it's all been all sauced up, especially with Lund Racing. So let's establish right off the bat what it takes to go 10s, 9s, and 8s. But what we're going to do in this video and concentrate on the power adder. We're not going to concentrate too much on the suspension, tires, because that can get way into the weeds. So let's just establish right off the bat, you're going to need a drag pack. That's bigs and littles, your choice of wheels. But we would want a 305 4517 if you're running 10s and 9s. Anything quicker than 9s, I think it's a benefit to put a 315 5017 back there. ET Street R. Suspension, Steeda Stop the Hop. If you want to go all the way with K-member and all that stuff, Steeda also makes a great K-member. Dampening, meaning shocks and struts. You can go Warriors front and rear. Again, we're not going to get into the minutia. You're also going to need axles. You're also going to need a drive shaft. Now, what we're going to do is mostly concentrate on the power adder, how much boost it takes to run what number, just to keep this video nice and tidy. Okay, 10 seconds boosted is absolutely cake. Any supercharger, any turbo, any forced induction can go 10s with as little as 8 psi and maybe 10 psi if you have a centrifugal. Almost every single boosted combination I personally have tuned that has gone 10s in a Gen 3 boosted car literally takes 8 psi if it's a single turbo or twin turbo, or 10 psi if it's a centrifugal or positive displacement supercharger. So let's start with centrifugal. Any Vortec or Paxton supercharger in a 10R80 boosted car can go 10s if you have a 3.6 pulley. Injectors, you can even have as low as a LU47 in there. That doesn't mean you should get an LU47, but in my opinion, as little as an LU47, if you see yourself being on pump gas for the foreseeable future, is fine. Why? Because the DI helps a little bit and you don't need such a big injector, but in my opinion, you should get at least 1000cc injector just to have plenty of headroom in case you decide to go E85 later on. Deachwork 95, FIC 1000H. The most preferred injector is going to be an ID 1050X because of its just startup and driving characteristics and data is pretty superior. So in my opinion, 1000cc injector, pump gas, 8 psi if it's twin turbo, or 10 psi if it's centrifugal, Vortec or Paxton will absolutely do it with a 3.6 pulley. Stock lower, pump gas, bada bing, bada boom. You don't even need a drive shaft, but you will need an axle. Believe it or not, on Gen 3, for whatever reason, the way the car transfers the torque, I've seen some stock axles bust. That's why I said in the beginning of the video, let's just throw everything at it. Axles, drive shaft, suspension, and a drag pack is the baseline for every combo on Gen 3. So again, Vortec, Paxton, 3.6 pulley is all you need. Now the ESS kits have made an insane resurgence, or not resurgence, I want to say insurgence. What do you call it when someone like invades? Because forever it was ProCharger, Vortec, Paxton, and all of a sudden ESS comes in like a tsunami and takes over the centrifugal car game under 1000 horsepower. Over 1000 horsepower, we talk F-series ProChargers, but not many people are running those superchargers. So an ESS G3, in my opinion, is the one to get. If you can afford the G3X, I would bypass the G2 altogether. And with the G3X and a 120 millimeter pulley, you can go 10s, no problem, with a Gen 3 10R80 car, pump gas, 1000cc injector, or as little as a LU47. But again, I really encourage you to buy yourself a 1000cc injector because we want you to have headroom for the future. All of these combinations are going to need a boosted pump. I definitely do not encourage you guys to run any boosted combination without a fuel pump voltage booster or boosted pump. I know some places copyrighted, or I don't know what they call it. They copyright the name boosted pump, but a fuel pump voltage booster from VMP, Vortec, or JMS will do just fine. Whipple 3.8 pulley. That's right. If you get yourself a Gen 5 front feed 3-liter Whipple, again 3.0 liter Whipple, and you get a 3.8 upper pulley, that should generate about 10 psi at sea level. That combination might get you deep into the 10s on pump gas if you have a 1000cc injector. And I would never suggest you buy a Whipple supercharger with anything less than 132 millimeter throttle body and 123 millimeter cold air, or what they would call, I think, the stage 2 package. It has a very good intercooler. It has excellent drivability characteristics. Lund Racing has figured out the throttle body tuning on Gen 3 10R80 stuff, but understand this, it is a positive displacement supercharger. So you might benefit from a second gear leave. That's right. The positive displacement superchargers on Gen 3 10R80 cars make enough torque to carry second gear all the way through the 60 foot and then some, and not really suffer any loss. Sometimes taking off in first gear has a very hard jolt on the 1-2, or if your track doesn't have enough prep, leaving in first gear with a positive displacement supercharger is probably not the best thing to do. On a centrifugal, absolutely. It makes nothing under 5,000 RPMs, so in my opinion, unless you have a very high stall converter, you should leave in first gear on a centrifugal, second gear on a positive displacement supercharger like the Whipple. Odin superchargers, because they're a Gen 3 TVS, I believe a 92 millimeter pulley is about 10 psi. Now, the 2650 rotor pack, in my opinion, only does well at really high boost levels. At low boost levels, it kind of has a similar power curve that the Whipple does. So when a lot of people ask me, Alex, which supercharger should I get, Whipple or VMP, I say, well, it all depends on what you want to do with it. I think you can go further with a Whipple than you can with a Odin. In my opinion, the Odin is a great supercharger if you want to be into the 10s fairly easily and maybe into the high 8s at max effort. But anything above and beyond that, I really would steer away from anything VMP makes for the Gen 3 because, in my opinion, I think they hit their peak in the Gen 3 rear feed setups from previous generations. But we'll talk about that a little later. Now, Edelbrock also makes a 2650, but in my opinion, it's a wash whether you want to use the Edelbrock or the VMP TVS. The VMP TVS, the Odin, has a twin bore throttle body called the TJ69. They also offer the big monoblade 132, I believe, or a 163. In my opinion, I would stay away from those 100%. They have about a 50% failure rate. The Edelbrock eForce 2650 has a awesome 103 millimeter throttle body that has similar electronics to, say, a Bullet throttle body, similar TPS slope. So in my opinion, that coupled with their 113 millimeter cold air is probably a better setup than the Odin would be, just based on the case configuration, and I have personal experience with both. Now let's get you into the 9s. So right off the bat, you're gonna need E85. Now, some people would say, but Alex, tell us how you can get there without installing a fuel system. That's not what I do here. I want to get you there safely. So you've already gone 10s. Any supercharger or twin turbo can get you into the 10s, or single turbo can get you into the 10s easily. Now let's get you into the 9s, and let's start with centrifugals again. So a Vortec with a 3.3 pulley or a Paxton with a 3.3 pulley should get you into the 9s quite easily. Again, E85 return style fuel system, 4 innovations level 2, rails, the whole 9 yards, 1000cc injector. But that same Vortec that you went 10s on with a 3.6, now you're on E85, about 21 degrees of timing, and a 3.3 pulley, whether it's a Vortec or a Paxton, should get you into the 9s comfortably. Now, because you've pulleyed down on that centrifugal, you might be able to launch in second gear. So you might want to play around with some of that and ask your tuner to give you a second gear leave tune to see if you can cut a better 60 foot, a better 330, and subsequently a better quarter-mile time. Odin. Well, to get into the 9s, you need about an 82 millimeter pulley. An 82 millimeter pulley should be about 12 to 13 psi on a 2650, maybe slightly above. The Odin, depending on the configuration, they do have a 120 millimeter cold air in the TJ69 or a big monoblade. An 82 millimeter pulley should get you into the 9s. Again, we're talking E85 and at least 1000 cc injector, and you will definitely benefit from a second gear leave tune on an Odin supercharger. Whipple, I would get as low as to a 3.3 or maybe a 3.2 pulley. It might sound a little bit on the aggressive side. Some of you might be able to go 9s with a 3.5 pulley, but I want to get you well into the 9s with that Whipple. And in my experience, the 3.3 and 3.2 pulleys really can get you into the 9s, no problem. Again, E85, 1000 cc injector, 3.3 or even 3.5. I'm sure it'll get you there, but I would shove a 3.3 or 3.2 in there right away. 1000 cc injector, 4 Innovations fuel system, E85, second gear leave tune. Now let's talk turbo stuff. There's a lot of turbo kits out there. You have the Hellion, you have On 3, you have BL Fab singles, you have Aldo kits, and I'm sure there's a couple of other kits that can get you into the 9s really easily. But in my opinion, you don't need turbo kits to get into the 9s. But if you want to grow with the turbo kit, honestly, my first choice is going to be an Aldo kit. Not only do I have a personal relationship with Aldo Welds, but everything I see that comes out of his shop not only is top-notch quality build, but it performs every single time. Nothing negative against people like Hellion or even On 3. I think you can get there with about 12 to 14 pounds of boost. You can get into the 9s extremely easily. Now, with a turbo kit, you're gonna need a converter. You're gonna need call Circle D. They'll spec out a converter for your turbo application, and you're gonna need a boost controller. I don't think you should really pony up big money for the AMS 2000. You can get an e-boost or something similar, and I think you'll be fine. It's a little bit of a pain in the butt to learn, but once you get it, you kind of get it. So with turbos, about 12 psi, whether it's a single or Aldo Welds or Hellion twin turbo stuff. With most other superchargers, ESS, I forgot about ESS. With a 110 millimeter pulley, you can make 800 horsepower on E85. My car made 795 on Sunoco 260 GT, so the ESS supercharger can absolutely get you into the 9s comfortably with a 110 millimeter pulley. Again, I really think you can benefit from a converter with all centrifugals, and you might benefit from a second gear leave tune. I didn't want to leave out ESS. Let's talk about going into the 8-second zone. Now this is, in my opinion, big boy stuff, and you're going to have to highly consider rebuilding and fortifying the 10R80 transmission. Reason being is it doesn't really like to shift above 850 or so rear wheel horsepower. I think you're fine going 10s and maybe deep 9s with the stock 10R80 clutches, but in my opinion, it's a good idea to consider a rebuild, extra clutches, or just clutches in general, because after 850 rear wheel horsepower, if your tuner does not have access to the special sauce 10R80 shifting, it's probably not going to want to make a shift. And when you do upgrade the clutches, you're going to need to make changes to the transmission so that it actually hits the shifts where you command. Now, let's start off with turbos, because in my opinion, that's going to be the one that requires, let's just say, more work to go into the 8s, but the turbos aren't working hard. It's just a matter of making the turbo kit work properly. You're gonna need a boost controller. You're gonna need an aftermarket converter. You're gonna need a second gear leave tune. You're gonna need a trans brake. You're gonna need a built transmission to get a turbo setup to go into the 8s. You're gonna need about 14 to 17 PSI depending on the kit. Some kits make great power at 15 PSI. Others just make a bunch of boost, bunch of torque, and float the valves and not a lot of power. So whether it's an Aldo kit, whether it's a twin turbo Hellion, or even on 3 with some downpipe modifications, I don't think it'll take more than, let's cap it at 17 PSI in order for your Gen 3 10R80 boosted car to go 8s. Again, E85 axles, shaft, suspension, dampening, Vikings, all that stuff, but now you're adding trans brakes, second gear leave, built transmission. It just requires a little more work, but with a turbo kit, in my opinion, you can go further, and the motor isn't working as hard to make the power. Whipple and Odin setups, probably gonna have to pulley it to about 20 PSI. Whether that's a 3.1 pulley or a 15% lower balancer, meaning a bigger lower balancer so you can spin the supercharger faster, and you have, let's say, a 3.2 or a 3.3 pulley, should generate probably 17 to 18 or close to 20 PSI, depending if it's an Odin, depending if it's a Whipple ported, unported Gen 5 3.0 liter. I really would stay away from the 3.8 liter unless you're really looking to get after it. In my opinion, the 3.8 liter has a lot of power potential, but the 3.0 is so proven with a 132 Whipple throttle body, a 123 millimeter cold air. That's all you really need. A lot of people are getting a little too aggressive with the throttle body size and the cold air size to run an 8-second quarter mile, when all you really need on a Whipple setup is a 132 throttle body, 123 cold air, about 18 PSI or so, and again, built transmission, aftermarket converter from Circle D, second gear leave tune. I think you can foot brake your way into the 8s. Trans brake I wouldn't really do on a 10R80 because, to be honest with you, I don't think it needs it on a positive displacement supercharger. So Whipple and Odin, in my opinion, are probably the quickest way to get into the 8s with a Gen 3 10R80 boosted car. I think the turbo stuff is great, but the amount of stuff you need to get it to go into the 8s, meaning boost controller, aftermarket converter, trans brake, all that wired in, and hopefully everything works, is just going to take a little more work than a positive displacement supercharger equipped 10R80 car would achieve going 8s. Now, when it comes to centrifugals, that's the one that I haven't seen many of. I haven't seen many centrifugal supercharged Gen 3 10R80 cars go into the 8s. It's not saying that there aren't any, but I haven't seen many of them. Not many people take this route, but I think with like an F-Series Pro charger making north of 20 PSI, I think it's possible. Matter of fact, I think it's probably one of the better ways to go. But in my opinion, because something like a Pro charger requires an aftermarket pulley to be shoved onto the snout and essentially extends the crank out, it's just going to tax your crank out a little more. So maybe with something like a crank support or something, a mechanism that does not allow much of deflection of the crank, if you have an auxiliary pulley pulling the centrifugal, I think is going to be pretty easy to get into the 8s. Again, pulley it to about 20 PSI, whether you use a V7, whether you use a G4 ESS or an F-Series Pro charger. I think configured properly, second gear lead, built trans, all the suspension, 1300s, E85, I think you can get a centrifugal car into the 8s pretty easily. Now, there's going to be a moment where you're going to decide, what am I going to do with this 10R80? I know this is a 10R80 video, but based on my experience, when you want to live for a sustained period of time in the 8s with a 10R80 car, you're either going to have to rebuild that transmission every season, because I have not seen many 10R80s last a full season at over 900 rear wheel horsepower. Typically, they get rebuilt at least once a season, and if you can afford $3,000 to $5,000 for a rebuild each time, God bless you. But most of my customers shove a turbo 400 in it. That's right. Sorry to say, but a lot of the guys that have a Gen 3 10R80 equipped car come to their senses pretty quickly by the second rebuild and say, if I'm going to pay every year of $5,000 to have someone rebuild it, why not just get a Reed Case 400 and live in that realm? Now, again, that's also expensive, but if you're drag racing, that's probably the best thing to do in the long run to save you some money. Hopefully this video wasn't too long-winded and you kind of understood where I'm coming from, but Gen 3 boosted 10R80 cars have a lot of power potential. You can get to the 10s very easily, 9s very easily, believe it or not, 8s with under 20 PSI on pretty much all boost combinations except maybe centrifugals, as long as you can afford to rebuild the 10R80 often. If you race it often, I think it's a pretty damn good transmission. In my opinion, if I had a 10R80 boosted car, I'd probably stick in the 920 to 970 zone and live a long, happy life and have multiple seasons on that 10R80. But if not, racing's expensive. That's just how it is, and it doesn't get more expensive than rebuilding a 10R80 every season. All right, guys, thanks for listening. We'll talk to you later.